Ladies and gents, there are two reasons for which you could be sat here watching this video today. The first is that you just love looking at my face in ultra high definition. This is a new webcam, I'm enjoying it. You can see exactly how many of my beard hairs have gone white. It's pretty cool. The second reason for which you could be sat here enjoying this YouTube content is that you want to get better at poker. There are many ways of going about that, but today the focus is on exploits. Very often on this channel, when we talk exploits, we might be talking about bluffing the river, bluff catching the river, spots being overfolded, underfolded, overbluffed, underbluffed, that kind of thing. Today, we're actually winding it back to the flop. We're going to be harvesting some of the really low-hanging, juicy, exploitative fruit, and I'm going to show you the two surprise weapons I've been building to execute in my own games against the population on the flop, and these, I believe, are very exploitatively effective. I'm going to show you why. Not telling you have to copy me, but you might want to, having watched this video. Let me show you how to execute these strategies. Before we get into it, just a quick reminder that the January sale is still live at Carrot Corner. It's going to be live for another 10 days or so until February the 1st, depending on when this video drops. Make sure you get involved. It's 25% off if you are going to embark on a rigorous, academic, serious poker education in 2025, then this is the right time to do it because everything is 25% cheaper. Let's get to the video. Let's meet these flop exploit strategies. Let me show you how I'm playing 3-bet pots this year. Enjoy. So here we have a game tree. We've talked about this in previous videos. The idea is that we're mapping out from the flop the sizes, the lines that we're going to be using in our strategy, so that we can easily execute this in game. And by clicking one of these nodes here, so either the flop or this turn card, the 5 of spades, or one of these river situations on the 4 of clubs, we can navigate to the relevant node in GTO Wizard and actually look at what the strategy looks like. You'll see here that we've picked the R20 strategy for this flop. This is small blind against button in a 3-bet pot with a small blind 3-better, and we're going to be range betting this board for 20% pot sizing. This is not the equilibrium strategy. On a queen high board, what you're going to notice is that there's less range betting going on. It's slightly more favorable for the in position player than other Broadway flops are. So king 8-3, jack 8-3, and to some extent ace 8-3 are better boards with a small blind 3-better than queen 8-3, and that's because of the density of offsuit queen X in a button flatting range compared with offsuit king X or jack X. So there's going to be a lot more combos like king queen off and ace queen off in the button's range for calling the 3-bet than there would be king jack off or ace king off. The former is going to be maybe folding or possibly 4-bet bluffing, and the latter ace king off is going to be 4-betting for value, right? So the queen is the worst Broadway for small blind, and that's why GTO doesn't range bet as many queen high flops in these late position 3-bet pots as it would in earlier position spots. But that said, when we simplify to range betting here, we cause the population a lot of questions. I want you to pause the video just now. I'm going to ask you a question. How often do you think the button should fold to a range bet of 20% of the pot in this situation? How often do you think they're folding? How much of their range do you think they're folding? Pause the video. Now let's take a look if you're ready in GTO Wizard. I went and did it, guys. I changed my color scheme in Pio. Personally, I thought the beige and dark brown theme was kind of like a sophisticated living room suite. It looked like some kind of really cool furniture. I quite liked it. I thought it fit well with the sort of academic, rigorous brand that is Carrot Corner. But apparently you guys hated it. You thought it looked like vomit or shit. So we changed it. We've gone classic vanilla Pio circa 2016 here. That should pacify you nerds, I hope. Here we go. Also kind of matching the hoodie a little bit, but not really. So we're going to go for range bet here. We've no luck that to happen. And the answer to the question I just asked you is that when we do this, we go to the button's response strategy, they are only allowed to fold 7-6 of clubs. So if your answer was that only 7-6 of clubs can fold and it should also raise sometimes and no other hand can fold, then congratulations, you are a GTO beast in this spot. You are not going to get exploited by my R20. You're not going to fall victim to it. But everybody else, if you answered 5% folds, if you answered 3% folds, 11% folds, you're getting exploited. If you're folding 20% of the time here, you are getting massacred by this strategy. Now, why might this be a good idea for you guys to actually implement in a game like, I don't know, I'm going to guess what you play, 25 NL, you all play it, or 50 NL, or 100 NL, or whatever, right? Any low stakes game, it doesn't really matter, any micro stakes game. People are going to fold with King 10 of clubs here. And if they do that, you can't quite see it, guys, right? It's a little bit off screen right now. But the EV that they're actually losing with that hand is like a small blind and a half. It's like between a small blind and a big blind. It's like 1.5 chips, right? That is absolutely huge if they fold that hand. And therefore, you know, you're going to be absolutely destroying them with this strategy. Another reason that I like to play the B20 or the range 20 strategy in this spot is that villain has to play a ton of raise in order to be playing well against this. So they have to raise a hand like pocket nines or pocket tens at a really high frequency, which is deeply counterintuitive because this looks like a depolarized hand, right? It looks like a showdown value hand, but actually you're betting everything. And the way they're meant to play against the B20 here, that's a range bet, is not that dissimilar to how they might play against a check. But they're not thinking that because the bet puts the human in the facing bet frame of mind, and then they're very likely to just like play as they would against a half pot bet or third pot bet, which they're probably still overfolding. So not only is it overfolded, it's also going to be under raised. The bluff raises they're going to struggle to find here. The top pair raises they're going to struggle to find here. They're just going to play really, really placidly against this and fold too much, and it's going to allow you to over-realize your fold equity and your equity. It's going to be really good. What you should really do, in my opinion, when you incorporate a new line into your game like B20, is that you should have a look at the resulting turn situations that arise. So if we jump back over to the game tree here in the PowerPoint, I've just picked a fairly generic looking turn. I would start with the two-tone turns, guys, the ones that bring a flush draw, rather than the ones that are rainbow, because the rainbow turn is only going to happen 1 in 4 times, but the flush draw turn is going to happen closer to 1 in 3. And so, yeah, 5 of spades is the first one we're looking at here. There are a lot of low cards. The low cards are, I think, trickier to play, because on the big Broadway cards, you can do a lot of barreling with it with impunity, really. And on the low cards, you can't. So a low two-turn turn is definitely the best place to start when you're analyzing this, I would say. So 5 of spades, we are going to be playing a B75 or check strategy. The reason that I'm not playing like a B60 or B50 or something here that you might see on the turn in 3-bit pot sims is that we went so tiny on the flop that there's a bit of extra pot building to be done. If you look over here at the 973 board, when we start with check, over on that texture, different spot, we'll come to that later, but when we start with check there and villain checks back, we're then playing overbet on the turn like B120. So I'm always kind of catering my one-sizing approach on turn to be SPR sensitive and logical from the point of view of like smoothly putting money in. That's just the way I'm setting up my game this year. I think it's just a healthy thing to do. So after we have played the range bet, we go for B75, and then on river, when we're tripling, we have either all in or give up. And if we have checked the turn, our range is less polar, so now we have less polarized sizings on the river. Makes sense, right? On the brick at least. So how do we build this B75 or check strategy? What are some useful heuristics here? Rather than just staring at a sim and getting lost in the weeds, let's look at the sim, but let me give you Pete's takeaways for barreling or not barreling the blank turn or the flush draw turn in this node. This is by far the most common turn spot you're going to be in after you R20. Start there. Always tailor your study so that you're looking at the things that are happening the most frequently. Build your game from the ground up in that way. Do not jump into some bizarre, weird line and spend 2 hours in it just because it bothered you one day and you lost a stack in it. It's not worth your time. So this world is one we deem kind of semi-unfavorable. It's not like a great spot for range. We've bet the flop, we've been called, we're out of position for one. We didn't get one of the turn cards that's really good for our range. You have to bear in mind that when you bet the flop small, the reason that that strategy is good is that it's still a reasonably high EV spot for you. And the reason it's reasonably high EV is that many of the turn cards that are coming are going to be these big cards like a king or an ace or a jack or something that are good for your range. There's also going to be some smaller ones that are less good. And when they come, your EV is going to go down, which is why your turn frequency here for barreling a B75 is going to be quite low. Pete's first takeaway for this spot is therefore that when you have hopeless trash in a node like this, you should give up, right? Pretty simple in theory. Maybe in practice you could make different arguments against different players for betting. But let's take a hand that is like really, really hopeless. And I mean like a very, very bad hand, right? So let's take a hand like the King 10 without a flush draw. that has higher check EV than bet EV, we're going to be giving up the hopeless stuff. Rule number 2 is that overpairs that unblock top pair, by virtue of not having that card in their hand, are going to be very high frequency bets. Makes sense, right? So whenever you're in a 3-bet pot, after any action sequence really, and you've bet the flop and you've been called and you have an overpair on a dryish board, you should usually barrel. Barrel is by far the safest play against population. If you're in a passive or nitty pool, you're going to see that they don't float bet enough when checked to on the turn in a 3-bet pot. They check back too much. They're too cagey. And therefore, you just want to put money in the pot with pocket kings again here. The next rule for incorporating a good, decent strategy into your game here is that you should mix with top pair. Top pair blocks the calling range more. It's going to be less of a mandatory value bet. So when you do have something like ace, queen, king, queen, etc., you should be mixing. At some point, you need to, again, start navigating like we looked at in the last video and try to find these thresholds. You're going to be looking at the value threshold. What's the weakest hand you can value bet for the chosen sizing in the toolkit? Here it's B75, and here the answer is, well, with Queen Jack of Spades you can, but with Queen Jack of Hearts or clubs you can't. So the value threshold here is around King Queen, Queen Jack. The next thing I would say is, where's the bluffing threshold? Where does your hand become sufficiently lacking in showdown value that you're able to turn it into a bluff? Well, if we look at the game tree here, we can see the ace king with a certain suit qualifies. We can see that that's fine, that's got enough going on. And you can see that when you have some form of straight draw here, like Jack 10, that's going to be betting as well. But for the most part, you know, the showdown value threshold here, the bluffing threshold, is just going to be around sort of ace high. It's just that most ace high doesn't have enough going on. It doesn't have enough equity redraw to go ahead and bluff. Ace jack is deemed too hopeless here, maybe a bit too blocking of the folding range as well, given the gutters that are folding. And instead, like ace king is able to bet with 2 overcards, especially with the spade, that's going to reduce your opponent's pure call combos like flush draws or even jam combos. Okay, so I think that spells it out well enough. One maybe interesting phenomenon here is like the difference between ace jack and ace 10, right? Because ace 10 is actually a hand that can double barrel when it's not a flush draw, and ace jack is actually checking when it's a flush draw and giving up when it's not. I'm guessing the difference here is that there are just more folds containing a jack in villain's range here than there are containing a 10, and I'm guessing that pocket 10s has to continue at some frequency again here to a bet, and 10s is going to block that, but jacks would have 4-bet pre in this configuration and is therefore not there. But we can test that theory, right? Just see if I'm actually right. So we bet here, and 10s is, yeah, it's doing, depending on the suit, it's doing some continuing, whereas jacks just, oh, jacks actually is here, but jacks is pure continuing. Okay, so that theory goes out the window. So there'll be something else going on here. I guess it's just that there's more, yeah, there's just way more jack X floats folding here, ace jack off just being a really common float. That's what it is. So sometimes you have to dig about a bit to see why that's the case. But yeah, the first answer was right, that in this sim, the jack is just way more blocking to the folding range than the 10 is. Anyway, we're in danger of getting lost in the weeds a bit here. Those are the takeaways for the turn strategy. Our main exploit here is going to come on the flop. That's where the fold equity is going to be really high. That's where we've over-realized our equity, etc. That might mean that the turn is not overfolded, or it might mean that the turn is still overfolded. It depends. My instinct here is that this turn spot isn't massively overfolded or anything, because just having a quick glance around, the underpairs are meant to sometimes call, sometimes fold. I think that's what's going to happen in pool. They're meant to call some bad-looking ones like 7s at times. That particular hand is probably a bit overfolded, and the rest of the strategy is pretty easy to play, actually. In this sort of board, you're calling your flush draw, you're calling your queen pure, you're folding the floaty stuff that didn't get there. I think the exploit here comes on the flop, and oftentimes that's the case. The lowest hanging fruit is on the flop, and then sometimes on the river. But basically, how to put this? The points where villain's range is the widest, weakest, the least protected, that's usually where the fold equity is going to come in spades. That's where there's going to be the most fold equity and the most overfolded spots. Okay, what I'd like to do now is switch over to the other spot and actually examine a situation where we're playing a really big c-bet in a 3-bet pot to take people out of their comfort zones on a completely different texture. So let's see how the B75 strategy works now. All right, so I'll talk you guys through this roadmap on the right-hand side now, which is for a bigger c-bet board, these are classically played by most regs as like a B50 or B60, something like this. They generally call for the bigger sizing because it's a more polarizing texture to the small blinds range, right? Where all overpair combos are very, very strong and all unpaired hands have missed. Contrast that to Queen 8-3, where jacks and tens are now devalued, the Queen 10 is hit, sort of, that kind of thing. So here, the in-position player has a more condensed capped range with the exception of sets. They're going to have 8s, jacks, 10s, 6s, ace, queen high, flush draw, jack 10. Lots of medium to low to high equity hands. It's like more of a spectrum. So given that in position is just more merged, more condensed here, and out of position is more polar by comparison, the bigger c-bet is just a very sensible way to construct your strategy. Don't get me wrong, if you do use a small c-bet here, the EV regret in equilibrium is not going to be that high. But in real life, I think it just makes more sense to build a strategy that's coherent where you're putting more money into the pot sooner against this range that's very pocket pair dense compared to yours, especially against like recreationals who are, you know, your main game against them is just a value bet and get lots of money in with your overpairs. So what's interesting here, in my opinion, is that when we've played the B75 strategy, our exploit comes again at the first possible opportunity. It comes on the flop. I believe that this is a very overfolded node in most game trees against most opponents, at least among the reg population. If you're against the fish, there are definitely elasticity centered imbalances that you want to make to your strategy, whereby you go bigger with your value, like your pocket kings can go B75, and you might just half pot when you have queen jack, right? And you're just like betting queen jack of clubs or something as the bluff. So that's a very effective way to capitalize on the less elastic opponents. Regs are a lot more elastic here to sizing. In fact, some of them are actually overly elastic and are going to get freaked out by this unfamiliar B75 line that they're not so used to facing. And so when you hit them with this cannon, you just break out and you're like, boom, you just fire the cannon at them on the flop. The overfold comes right there and then. They go through a sort of fight or flight gate quite quickly. And then what we see from data and what we see from experience is that the turn and river nodes after the big c-bet there are going to be a bit less overfolded than they would on certain runouts after a small flop c-bet. So I want to say that you're using up a lot of fold equity in one go here with the B75 on the flop, and you have to bear that in mind, because if you do B75 the flop here, it's probably not going to be the case that you just want to blast off exploitatively and expect everything to be overfolded thereafter. The other nice thing about this is that you can simplify your strategy here on the turn to using all in or check on certain cards. Like a low card, you can actually just play shoves for a little bit more than pot or check. That's totally fine. You're interested in denying equity to flush draws. If the board is like 9-7-5 or something, there's going to be 8s and 7-8 and 6s that are pair plus draw that are really good to just get called by or get them to fold their equity. Playing jam on a myriad of different low cards here is going to be a good idea. On higher cards, they're going to be, well, on the node where you've B75 the flop, you can do things like betting small with lots of your range again on a king or something like that. The ace is kind of an anomaly. It's a very bad card for your range. The solver's actually range checking here on the ace turn, or close to it. And the reason for that is that lots of the opponent's calling range to a big c-bet on the flop is like either ace queen high with the backdoor or without, or something like ace x of spades. They're folding many underpairs immediately on the flop here to B75, the ones that don't have a spade. And they're, of course, folding like most of their king-jack type stuff that's not a backdoor flush draw or front door flush draw on the flop. So the ace turn is incredibly polarizing to them. It leaves their pocket pair very devalued and kind of dead, and their ace x just becomes really strong, and therefore it doesn't make sense to do much betting at all on that card. That might seem counterintuitive, but there's a really big difference here, guys, between like an ace turn and a king turn, because villain is calling way more ace x on the flop than they are king x on the flop here to the big c-bet. On the check node, and we'll look at all of these in the solver in a second, where we've checked the flop, and we will be doing this more often because we're playing a bigger c-bet, so we'll be c-betting less frequently as a result. Therefore, we'll want to study this node more, because if you're playing a B75 on the flop, you do end up checking the flop much more often than if you're playing a range bet or even a B33 or a B50. So because of that, you want to focus on what you're doing on the turn. And my game plan for turns is really quite simple. For the most part, if it's not a really polarizing turn to the opponent, I'm going to be just building my betting range around really strong hands and bluffs. The ace is not as bad for us here. We've actually checked a load of our ace-x on the flop. We quite like the ace now, but still we can just build a polar betting range around good ace-x plus for value, checking our kings and queens. And on the deuce of diamonds again, we can play a polarized betting range for 120% pot, making up for the lost ground, trying to get that pot building a bit faster because we're on a check branch where pot has stagnated for a street on the flop. So now we're going at this with different bluffs and value hands on the deuce of diamonds turn that are top pair, over pair, that type of thing. So let's take a look at how these different nodes play out in the solver. GTO Wizard, by the way, gives me this countdown whenever I change screens, just to stop me using this like in game. It's thwarted all of my plans. I was planning on just RTAing with my PowerPoints and beating the games that way, you know, and then pretending I did it all without RTA, but now I can't. I've been thwarted. But no, in seriousness, I think this is a really good thing. Anything we can do to stop people cheating at poker. For the record, I don't actually think that copying solver outputs is the most devastating way people can cheat, but I still think it's obviously bad and something we want to avoid. So good that they have these built-in protections. Okay, so back to the normal pile scheme here. This is the turn node. I think we should probably just start with a quick look at the flop strategy though. So let's navigate over to that. This is the B75 flop strategy for small blind. Let's come up with some rules. Whenever you're looking at a sim, you want to build some heuristics that are really easy, that you can remember, that you can write down. You don't just want to get lost in the sea of combos. So yeah, rule number one here is going to be that your value range mixes between check raising for the most part and betting big. The more vulnerable your overpair and the stronger your overpair as a combination of factors, the more often you're going to bet. So you can see here that Jacks is the overpair with the highest bet frequency because it is the one with the highest blend of power and vulnerability. If you had a different sim where the opponent didn't have Jacks here, tens would also get closer to a pure bet. A weird anomaly here is pocket nines, by the way, just checking. Blocking the top pair here, unblocking the overpair from the opponent that's going to bet, the draw that's going to bet, the bluff that's going to bet. These blockers are kind of polarizing to the opponent's range, right? Removing the good to middle hands. They're more likely to call but check back a decent amount, like 9x. But yeah, that's an anomaly. Rule number two for this situation is that when you're bluffing, there is some form of standard again, but not a very high one. So the standard is what I would say here is not super strict, but it's something, right? So when you have two overcards to the board, you don't need to have a backdoor to bluff. Pair draw on a board like 9-7-3 is sufficient when you have two overcards. But when your hand becomes worse than that, because you only have one overcard, it now becomes essential for you to have the backdoor. So I don't know what you want to call that in your own framework for learning poker, but I would refer to it as something like lenient standards for bluffing. Something like this, like unstrict requirements apply. There are requirements, but they're not super strict. Moderate strictness. I don't know. Whatever you want to call it, the idea is that when you have two overcards, you can go for it regardless of suit. And when you only have one, suit becomes more important. That's about the standard we're talking about here. If this board was worse for you, it was like 6-5-4 or something, that standard would go up, right? And you'd have way more auto check fold hands on the flop here. So we've talked about value betting standards. We've talked about bluffing standards. What's really left here is to talk about the middle. Where is the middle of the range? And unsurprisingly, if you're using B75, you don't make the sort of bets with pocket eights that you can make if you're playing a B50 here. You have to cut those out. You have to get a little bit more polar. But there is going to be some degree of like hybridy weird stuff going on here with a hand like ace king, whereby it's not as bad to bet ace king combos as it is to go ahead and bet pocket eights, because when you B75 here, you do actually start to garner a bit of fold equity from better hands. If we go to Villain's strategy here and have a look at that, I just added a smaller raise to illustrate that it wouldn't do it here. It's basically playing like call, all in, or fold. And when we go over here, we can see that sixes is already pure folding, eights is already pure folding when it doesn't have the spades. So I think if you're against like a looser recreational player here, sorry, I covered myself up. If you're playing against a looser recreational player here, you're actually going to do really well by just like value betting your big hands this size and going a bit smaller with your bluffs, something like that, because they're constructing their calling range more linearly and probably like calling a pair before they call ace queen high. On the topic of ace queen high, this is like the main defend actually for villain here, is like over cards that have showdown value and can redraw against your pocket pairs. This is a really important thing for villain to start mixing defense with. So even stuff like ace jack off with the spade there, doing a lot of defending. This in my mind is why this is overfolded. I'm strongly led to believe that this overfold is quite big here on the flop, and because of that, the exploit against the regulars is kind of just to bet big and then to play more normally after that. Like you're over bluffing. If you're going to over bluff in this line, it should probably happen on the flop, because the solver's fold percentage here is only 41%, and I think intuitively you guys will just have a sense that it's working more than that, right? Not only this, but like humans also over defend to 3-bets in a lot of cases as well. They're calling like the low pocket pairs too much. They're calling suited connectors too much. They're not mixing enough 4-bet in with certain hands that should be 4-betting pre. They're calling king jack off instead of folding or 4-betting, that kind of thing. So in real life, I think, you know, fold equity here is, I don't know what it is, I would guess over 50%. I feel like when you B75 this board in real life, it probably gets through 52%, 51. I don't know, I'm just making up numbers, but way more than 41. I think it's a pretty big overfold. I think the lower stakes you play against a regular and the less studied your opponent is on in position defense, where you're actually meant to like exceed the MDF, right, in position. Game theory wants to make the out of position players' bluffs awful if they had nothing. Not just kind of bad, but if you had 2 cards with like pictures of dogs on them that couldn't interact with the rest of the deck, they were like these weird cards that were just worthless and couldn't even make a pair. Like pair of dogs isn't a hand. You know, out of position should be losing money by betting that hand, right? It shouldn't be an optionally okay thing for them to do. Therefore, when in position, you know, wielding their positional advantage, folds just at MDF, they actually kind of let out of position off the hook a little bit there. So we're trying as in position here to over defend relative to MDF in a 3-bet pot. That's a really key takeaway. We discussed that a lot actually in grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School when we look at like defending 3-bet pots. And the main idea here is that you just have to defend way wider, especially on these lower boards that are okay for you than you would think. So that's the lay of the land on the flop here. Let's go to the turn, take a look at what's happening. So we're playing the deuce of diamonds as either all in or check. This is pretty simple. Another reason I quite like this strategy is that it's really quite easy to execute. There are a few caveats here, but for the most part, you're just going to be jamming more pure with your more vulnerable overpairs and slow playing more with the bigger overpairs. There's something going on with aces and kings here as well that makes kings want to slow play. Perhaps some ace x is bluffing now, and we want to unblock that and give them a bit of rope. I don't really know exactly what's happening here, but yeah, there'll be some pattern there. And as far as bluffing goes, there's going to be some standard, right? Because we're going all in. Like we're shoving for just over the pot or whatever. So we're going to need to be applying some standards. If we have king jack of clubs, therefore, we don't want to do anything. Even king jack of diamonds unblocking the club, we don't want to do anything. We just want to check. And then when we have a higher equity draw or value hand, we can consider jamming. So even ace 5, you know, ace 3 as like a weird hybrid getting called by a flush draw. That makes a ton of sense, actually, getting called by hands we're ahead of, getting folds from hands that are ahead of us, that kind of thing. And then the other weird hand to look at here is like the 2 overcards with the spade blocker. You want to block villain having ace jack of spades. Like if you shoved, I don't know, like ace jack off here, you're getting called every time by ace jack of spades, which is just free rolling. Whereas when you have the spade and you shove, villain folds like ace jack of clubs, and like you might say like you're making them fold a hand, it's the same, but just winning the pot versus not here is valuable, because if you do check, you are often losing this pot, right, one way or another, even if that's by folding the best hand. Is happening a fair bit. And then top pair can shove here. You don't need to have a massively thick value hand to do it. King 9 or something is good enough. It's getting some denial. It is losing to jacks and 10s, sure, and sets and stuff like that, but it's also getting called by a ton worse as well. Okay, let's quickly look at the ace of diamonds. I just want to sort of illustrate that point again here. So whatever sizes you give the solver here, it's basically just not going to bet, right? I'm going to change this ace of diamonds. And here, if we're playing shove check, it does just check. But even if we were to go ahead and add a few more sizes here, let's say that we just put in like a B50 for the sake of it or whatever, I think we'll find that it's not really going to be interested in betting at all into like a polarized range, right? So it's just not using any bet size here. It just thinks the opponent's incredibly polarized on the ace turn. And look at the SPR, you know, you've just got an SPR of almost 1, so you can go ahead and just wait until the river and then put it in there. You don't need to be betting into this uncapped, freshly polarized range when you can be checking and then just like doing your polarizing on the river. So that's kind of what's going on there. That's a weird anomaly though. Like, let's look at some other turn cards just to show the difference. Like, most turn cards, there's going to be a bunch of betting going on. Let's take a card like the Queen of Hearts. Like, there, we're back to just betting a lot again. Obviously, our value standards are going to change a bit on that card, but even jacks, like, you can still shove at SPR 1. The other thing to get into your head if you are going to play a strategy like this that leaves a very low SPR for the turn is that you don't have to be nutted to shove at SPR 1. Stacking off is a really misleading thing to think in poker, because people are like, well, I'm stacking off, I need to be really strong to invest all of my chips. No, at SPR 1, don't think of it that way. You're just investing pot. Pot is not that much more money. It's like the only amount that can go in. Okay, if you're potting it with another 5 times that behind, you have to be careful about doing that with jacks here. But when it's the last money that's going in, jacks is going to get called by draws that it's ahead of. It's going to get called by underpair that it's ahead of, 9x that it's ahead of. Yes, when it runs into king, queen of spades, it's dead and it feels awful. That doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. You do want to be aggressive for value at SPR 1. Yeah, I don't want to give you guys any more bombardment of information on this. The main takeaways for today are as follows. Basically, when we're playing the R20 strategy, we're relying on a big overfold happening right away. And then, depending on the card, there might still be some overfolds happening later in the game tree as well. But R20 is going to be absolutely butchered, really mishandled by populations at low and micro stakes. Kind of a good way to go, simple for you to execute. Enough said. And with the B75, I think it's going to be really badly mishandled by regs, like very overfolded for sure. Against recreational players, it might be a bit less so, because they're less elastic, basically. They're more inelastic and just kind of going by their own hand strength. And so you have options against them of like sizing up with different parts of your range, sizing down with others. Might feel totally crazy, right? And like you're super unbalanced, but that's what you should be doing against recreationals. And then when you have played a B75 strategy, try to navigate turn with all in or check mostly, and look for cards that are like very polarizing to the opponent. The exceptions there might be like 3 flush cards where you actually build a block bet and stuff like that, but do your own exploration, you know, let me know how it goes. These are just options. As always in these videos, I'm not saying you have to play this way. I'm giving you an insight into how I'm building my own strategies. I'm showing you how to combine exploitative ideas with theory ideas. If you want to do that further, the Carrot Poker School has 3 theory grades, 1 exploit grade. It's like over 40 hours of footage, homework tasks with feedback videos, all sorts of stuff. And the best part, it's 25% off for January only. Click the top link in the description for that. And I'll see you back here for more content soon. Thanks for watching. Good luck at the tables.